Hey, Leona, I think you're on mute there.
Yes, I am. First technical fail. Well done. Welcome to everybody who's joining. And we will get started in a couple of minutes. We're just going to give another minute or two for some more people to jump on. And then we will get started with what's looking very promising to be a very exciting chat. Just to say to everybody that's joining now, give them a heads up, please do get involved with chat, ask questions throughout. We will be taking questions throughout as well as at the end. So please do drop messages in the chat, ask whatever you want to ask, and make sure you get the most out of this event. Also, just to let people know that this event will be recorded and it will be shared on Monday. So if anybody has to drop off at any point, don't worry, you'll still be able to catch those valuable insights at the end. Okay, so we'll just give it a couple more minutes. So if somebody's joining and you're wondering why nothing's happening, we're just going to leave it open for another minute or two to make sure that everybody is able to join, and then we will jump straight in with the talk. In the meantime, I hope you're all well air conditioned and nobody is struggling too much with the heat. I think that's like the latest meme, isn't it? It's all about the air conditioning. Everybody is on socials, just pictures of air conditioning. Right, I think it's probably about time that we get started. So I would like to welcome the panel. First, I'll just introduce myself. So I'm Leona and I am the CFO for Rebank. Rebank is the financial dashboard for startups and scale-ups. We help make everything a bit faster when it comes to payments and banking and things like that. I've got a wonderful panel here with me to talk about business travel, and they're all amazing experts in their field. So I will start. Vicky, if you would like to just introduce your role and let everybody know why you're here talking about this today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the UK and Ireland country manager at TravelPerk. TravelPerk help businesses manage their business travel in a very streamlined way. So we're here to make life easy for people and also to help travellers travel in a happy and sustainable way as well.
Fantastic.
Leona, you're on mute, but I don't know what you said, but I'll introduce myself.
Cool, great. Thank you.
I'm Tony Schaefer. I'm got a background as a finance director and a CFO, and I still do that to an extent in a portfolio capacity. But a lot of what I do is working predominantly with finance leaders on the executive coaching, and very much around mindset and stories they're telling themselves, which are maybe holding them back from moving forward in the direction that they actually want to go.
Thank you, Tony. And last but definitely not least, Paddy.
Thank you very much, Leona. Very excited to be here, folks. My name is Paddy, and similar to Vicky, I am a country manager looking after the UK and I with Spendesk. So Spendesk is a platform to help businesses manage their spend more effectively, be that big, more traditional spend, or of course T&E, travel and expense spending as well. So we partner with finance teams across Europe with over 4,000 clients between primarily France, UK, and Germany. And very excited for this topic because we certainly have been really observing with a front row seat as to how I think business travel is kind of transforming over the last couple of years in particular. So very, very excited to join both Vicky and Tony with hopefully sharing a couple of interesting insights from what we've seen.
Thank you, Paddy. And that leads us very nicely into the talk. So let's just jump straight in and let's talk about the changes in business travel over the last 12 months. And do you want to tell us what impact that's had on finance leaders, travel managers and just everybody involved, really, all the stakeholders. Vicky, do you want to kick us off there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably 12 months ago, Leona, is when we all started to kind of see a significant rise in people being back out on the road again, or wanting to kind of take that step, whether it be kind of team meetings or offsites, maybe customer supplier meetings and so on. We're now at the point where, you know, many of our sort of thousands of companies and customers that we look after, typically around probably about 85% of the travel that they were doing pre-COVID. Some companies have far exceeded that, but yeah, it's definitely back on track. Going back to your point on like how has that impacted, you know, the different personas, I guess, from a finance perspective, I think budgeting for travel or for business travel has been incredibly hard. Finger in the sky kind of comes to mind a little bit. There's been a period of time where there was no business travel, and no business travel means quite significant savings to a business. So finance people have loved that to a degree. However, I think, you know, now it's about really measuring the impact of the cost of business travel versus the benefit of having in real life interactions, you know, bringing your internal teams together, having offsites, which I know Paddy's been doing recently, actually, having, you know, going to meet your suppliers in person, and the way in which those types of interactions and that type of cost can actually drive your business forward. So it's definitely been important to do things like recommunicate travel and expense policies that maybe people haven't used for some time, look at best practice, maybe look to improve processes that you had, you know, 12 months ago, 2 years ago. And I think for many customers that I speak to, it's about trying to streamline the, you know, the expense requests that they get or that they're starting to see come back in. And maybe for startups, maybe they've never had them before because they didn't exist 2 years ago, or travel just wasn't a thing. So yeah, lots to consider. And, you know, for actual travelers as such, it's been very different as well. It's been much more about getting confidence to go back out on trips. You know, very often after the first trip, it is absolutely fine. But, you know, over the last 12 months, it's been about, we were in the realms of entry forms to get into any destination, even a form to get back into the UK, with very specific requirements as to when that had to be completed. COVID passports, vaccine passports, pre-departure tests. So lots of, you know, an ever-changing landscape, really. And at TravelPerk, we've been helping our customers through that, through some of our inbuilt travel safe technology, and giving people sort of automated inbuilt reminders of all of the information that they would possibly need. So yeah, a very changing landscape, I would say, in the last 12 months.
That's really interesting. I just picked up there, and when you were saying like how to manage expense requests and how people were interacting together, Paddy, I bet you get loads of really interesting insights with obviously your product. What's your thoughts?
Yeah. Listen, I think it's really fascinating. I think something that Vicky said, you know, you take it off. You can take something off the budget. Maybe Tony might back this up. It's very hard to get it back onto the budget. You know, once something's gone, you know, typically we're kind of saying, right, that is done. But absolutely, I think, you know, from looking to our platform and the nature of spend, it gets very, very interesting. I think it backs up a lot of what Vicky was saying. This March 2020, travel died. And there was nothing across most of 2020, bar a few spikes here and there in between these lockdowns with limited use of you know, kind of T&E budgets. We didn't see very much. Now, the interesting thing we did see, you know, and I think you're probably getting towards mid-21 and towards the end of 21, was we actually saw an initial kind of explosion of travel, just for more of a short period of time, and I think it makes sense. People hadn't been traveling that much. People had distributed teams. I remember from myself personally, you know, I think I probably went 14 months without meeting, you know, many of my teammates in person. Many people we had hired and we got to know each other, and it was 14 months later before we got to see them. So we took that opportunity to travel and travel again. And for finance teams, that in particular was very difficult, because I think finance leaders recognize, and I think the modern finance leader recognizes the value of these cultural engagements. They recognize the value of people working together and how that can drive efficiencies in the business. But when something was off the budget, then to see it go back onto the budget was quite a challenge. So I do think it's been a very fascinating, listen, it's been a very difficult time for many people. I don't think it's really right to kind of say this is a fascinating experiment, but taking the step back and looking at the nature of how these things have changed is really interesting. I think today what we're seeing is, again, we're seeing a lot more kind of thoughtful travel, as opposed to, I think, and I remember 2018, 2019, a meeting wasn't going your way, you would jump on a plane. And I certainly did that before. But I think we're now looking at rather, not as certain economic times ahead of us in one state. You have a macro trend about how to, this environmental friendly piece, which is, I think, really, really important, both for obvious reasons, but also for businesses to get behind this. And you're now seeing things, I believe we're seeing more thoughtful travel. We're seeing travel trips longer, potentially rather than doing 3 trips, in a month, you're doing 1 week in that month. And that to me is, I think, the interesting change that we are observing now. More thoughtful in travel, really making those moments when you are together count versus, very trigger happy with when you jump on a plane or a train.
There's so much that I want to dig into there, Paddy. I was like, oh, I want to go, no, I want to dig into that. I think picking up on the last part of like how people are viewing it, Tony, I'm sure you've got a ton of things to contribute there. What's your thoughts on how people view things? And
yeah, I mean, go on, sorry.
I was just going to say the way they decide and look at things and those decision-making processes.
Yeah, I mean, I really like and I'm not saying it's necessarily what's happening all the time, but I really like that phrase that Paddy used quite a few times there, is that thoughtful travel. And I think having more of that, really getting people on all sides to really appreciate and really think about, okay, why am I traveling? What's the reason for this? And having more joined up these conversations, as opposed to, because yes, invariably, if you've had cost cuts in 2020, 2021, as a result of COVID, the natural response in normal times would be, right, okay, well, we're not going to have year on year increase of 50%, because we're now working to a different budget. We're now working to a far constrained budget in terms of costs. However, if you can be having more joined up conversations where it is about more, right, okay, let's really think about this. Let's think about this from your perspective, i.e. maybe someone who's more operational on the ground, versus the finance perspective. Okay, it's not in the budget, but how can we look at the budget in a way that ultimately is going to potentially be included in the budget, because it's adding more value. It's adding more value to the top line. It's maybe getting more retention. It's increasing the culture, improving the culture of the business, because there's so many people probably who've joined businesses pre-COVID and during COVID and never actually met any of their colleagues, which pre-COVID you would have just said, you've been in this business for a year or however long, and people would have said that's absolutely crazy. But I think, and this is why I love that phrase, thoughtful travel, because it shouldn't just be that automatic reaction. Okay, let's go on a plane, let's go on a train, because that's what we've always done. It's thinking about what is the best way to spend the money. And it's not just the money, it's the spending the time as well. Because when you're on the road, when you're traveling, if you've got, and this is then again why what Paddy was saying about maybe instead of having 3 trips, within a month, you maybe have one longer trip which confines a week, and that saves time. It saves money, obviously, in terms of the actual cost of flying or getting the train back and forth. But it's also a more efficient way to do it in terms of time. So I would say having more of those open, rounded conversations where it can be, there's real collaboration working, and it's not a case of, right, okay, well, I'm not going to, the finance person is, I don't want to approve this, and you have this tension. Whereas actually, if the operational people who are wanting to who are wanting to do the travel, they can try and understand where the finance person's coming from, and the finance person can try and understand their world and where they're coming from. You're more likely to get that collegiate spirit, you're more likely to get that collaboration, and you're more likely to arrive at an answer which is ultimately in the best interest of the business.
Thanks. I just wanted to circle back to something that you mentioned, Paddy, if that's all right. You were talking about remote workers, and that it has really changed so much. And I talk about it with other finance leaders all the time. The how, what, where, what next, how should it look like? What do you think it's changed for businesses, and what should we be looking at, or could we be looking at?
So when we think about the kind of mixture between remote, hybrid, and these type of topics, yeah, because I think it is, to be honest, I think it is probably the hottest topic we have in Spendesk right now. One of the big challenges a lot of companies have faced, I think, over the last 12, 18, well, certainly over the last kind of 12 months, is actually on recruitment. We know what the impact of COVID has been in terms of great resignation, and that there's a lot of great literature about that, but I think around people actually trying to find more fulfilling roles and everything like that. And it did really challenge a lot of companies and how we scale back up our organizations. And I think what a lot of companies, then started to do was to reimagine what does it mean to be an employee? What does it mean to go to work? Because I don't know about the other panelists here, but remote working to me was a strange concept in 2019. And people say I work remote, I'm like, that's a bit odd. Which is like, it was something that wasn't even in our lexicon really. And now today, it's very much standard. The challenge that I face personally when it comes to this, and I think it leads into travel quite a bit, is I do believe that having a fully remote team can be quite straightforward in some senses, because you can have these thoughtful moments where you get together, and depending on the team, depending on that team's maturity, depending on that role that team does, whether it's once a month, once a quarter, or whatever that might be. And you can really plan out these times to get together from wherever you are in the world. And I think they're very valuable moments for people to start working together. I think obviously everyone working in the same space makes operationally some things quite easy. But where we're kind of finding ourselves land on is this kind of hybrid model, which is, this is the one that challenges me quite a bit. Because to me, I'm a firm believer that culture drives results much more than operational excellence. And I think that goes, and I think we're seeing a shift even in finance leaders now starting to think this way. How do we empower our team to do the best work of their careers? And when you have things like hybrid, that gets in the way. What can also get in the way is maybe very rigid travel policies. So that you have, what ends up happening is you have these people who are almost feeling like mercenaries. What they do is they punch in from their bedroom or from their home office, they do their 9 hours, they send a few Slack messages, and they do some things. They might perform well, but are you really building this kind of inclusive culture that I firmly believe drives best results? So this is something that we've been working with a lot. We have quite a few hybrid employees even here in the UK. And this is where we've kind of got to finding out what works best for us in terms of getting people together. And what we've landed on is something, and I think we'll probably talk about it at some point, is more on the type of travel policy that we have, which is at Spendesk, what works for us is freedom, trust. We allow people to make the best decisions for them. And we try not to get in their way, because we believe the more policies for us right now at this stage of our growth is going to really, really slow us down and drive more bureaucracy. Maybe it's not going to work forever for us, but that's how we've really seen this work quite well. Allowing your teams to work together, but giving those individuals the freedom. And I think tools like TravelPerk can be awesome for this as well, giving them the platform so that they can very much manage their travel easy. They can make the best decisions for them. And you can really find that you might have teammates all over the world, but you still build that great culture, maybe from these as I said, I don't want to keep going back to it, but these thoughtful moments that you all spent together.
Thanks for that. We have just got a question come in, but it is on basically HMRC. So unless I've got any volunteers to field a question on P11Ds, unfortunately we may have to abandon that question. But thank you for offering something up. So all that being said, that's all really I guess thought-provoking, to be honest. How is expense policies really going to tackle all of these nuanced items? You know, you've mentioned not being too rigid, but where does that leave us?
I believe it is one of the most interesting topics when you think about expense policies and travel policies. And trust me, I'm not paid to say, well, I technically am paid to say this, and I can't believe if my friends ever told me that one of the most interesting topics around was expense policies and how that is. But I think when you think about it, something like this, you know, an expense policy, I believe is so core and fundamental to your business, because I believe you can judge a company's culture by their travel policy, by their expense policy. And I think it's a great opportunity. And what I've seen the best companies do is when they sit down with a pen and paper or whatever that might be to start drafting their expense policy, they start with their principles, they start with their values. And that reflects the whole way through the company, the whole way through their policy. Because it's all well and good, you know, the company, you know, at Spendesk, a lot of what we believe in is trust and freedom. Now, if we had an expense policy and a travel policy that was line by line, you know, 42 different lines, and takes you 35 minutes to figure out can you buy a cup of coffee or not, that doesn't really suit, you know, what we're telling people when we're employing them or when we're trying to keep them happy and we're trying to grow them. So that's, you know, from and we've looked at, trust me, way too many expense and travel policies over the last I think 6-9 months. The best ones always start with a small paragraph that is driven with your company core values. And from there, to be honest, once you write out that paragraph, I will guarantee most of the viewers on this webinar, the policy will start to write itself.
And just, I mean, I've got a view on this. I mean, you know, very often those policies will be written, they'll be thought out and considered from the top, in line with the company values. But and I think you need to have some semblance of a policy, because otherwise it just leaves people in limbo and they're uncertain as to what to do. But if you can, for me, the more you can make it inclusive with everyone, in the sense that you have a sense of, right, this is what we want to achieve, but actually asking people more junior in the organization across all levels, well, what's your perspective on this? Have you got anything to add? Have you got anything that you want to input into this? And I'm not saying that you necessarily have to agree with everything they said, but at least if they are part of the policy writing, you know, they've created the policy collaboratively, they're far more likely to buy into it, as opposed to, oh, management, here's another thing management have mandated down. And you're just going to get far more of that buy-in across the board.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, Tony. And I mean, I also, same as Paddy, see a lot of travel policies. So the ones with the paragraph with the values, yeah, at the top of my list too. So I think it's, you know, it doesn't need to be a lengthy policy document almost. It's more guidelines, it's more setting the right expectation. It does depend on a company's culture, but actually if you give people the tools that are going to guide them in the right direction, you know, if they're not allowed to book X, then, you know, on our platform, for example, don't let it show, like, you know, tell them with a green traffic light, you know, what's going to actually kind of point them in the right direction. And then actually it feels less like a policy and more like just guiding you to make the right decision for your business. And I think, you know, people are much more open to that, definitely.
Yeah.
Can I just play devil's advocate for a minute and say, what about when this goes wrong, and how can businesses mitigate the risk? Because there's always going to be a finance leader who said, well, this one time somebody really took advantage and therefore that's why I've put these controls in place. How can we provide comfort to those people who may have that potentially well-founded view based on their previous experience, to show them that there are controls to put in place to mitigate that?
Yeah, from our side at Travel Perk, if you want controls, you can have as many as you like. So if you want to turn up the notch, then absolutely. If you want to have things like, pre-trip approvals, for example, so that things can't be booked unless they go to an approver, all of those things are possible. So I think what's most important is understanding your business, understanding what's right for your employees, and then finding a solution that ticks those boxes, and something that is flexible, something that can change and adapt as you grow. That's I think that's key.
That's really good to think about in terms of how software could perhaps solve this with both Spendesk and Travel Perk. Is that something that also that you're looking at, Paddy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really interesting thing, because in many ways, with travel policies, with expense policies, and everything that goes with this, I think well-written policies these days are designed. I think it was something both Tony and Vicky probably mentioned. The last question is, you got to remove the kind of ambiguity around this, not leaving people in limbo. Give them, understand what you can and can't do to an extent, and of course guide them in the right direction. But let's face it, I really do believe employees, and they react well. They, I think they perform well when they're trusted and they have the freedom. Now, at the same time, and as I'm sure Tony's probably felt as well from the FD side, the CFO side, you also need the control and the visibility on what they're actually doing. And I do think it's an interesting point. And I've seen the Travel Perk platform before, and I think it's brilliant. And it's a similar thing from Spendesk. What we're trying to do is solve that kind of, that contradiction between giving trust and freedom on one side, and then giving visibility and control on the other side. Because by nature, those two things are completely, they're polar opposites. And I do think it's a really interesting thing that I think the finance leaders of today, the people leaders of today, are quite blessed with, not only just Spendesk and Travel Perk, but a lot of different pieces of software out there that can help them, I think, drive towards the right things.
And just like, think, picking up on that sort of trust and freedom, and if you've got a policy whereby there maybe is a bit loose, encouraging people to be sensible and, take their own initiative. I think it's important that, I don't think that's wrong, but I think it's also important that people know that they're being monitored, and that someone, whether it's the CFO or the FD, and not necessarily just looking, checking on everything they're doing, but actually the trust and the freedom, someone's still looking over it. So someone's still assessing where you're spending, and maybe it's something that gets reviewed, and conversations are had about it, to where there was something where there's a bit of, you're a bit unsure, okay, why have they spent that, and having a conversation, okay, I just want to see, you had this trip going to this particular place, explain to me a bit more, so that people will know that it's not complete freedom to go and weigh and spend whatever you want, and no one's actually looking at it. But when people realize that actually there's people looking at this, assessing it, they're far more likely to be in a position whereby they are going to be coming back to what's really important, is being sensible and being thoughtful.
And I think, Tony, I don't know if you'd agree, but I also think there's a good opportunity, and something that I think we've tried to do a bit, but I think we could do a little bit further on this, is increase the financial literacy of the business and of all the people within the business, to actually understand that, hey, this isn't just, some fun money to go on holidays. This comes from a budget line. It comes from a cost center. It affects our cost of acquisition. It affects, all of these different metrics. It may be a £3 coffee or a £3 flight, but they're all coming from these budgets that are assigned to us, for us to produce from the business. I think once people start to understand a little bit more, let's face it, not everyone needs to know your CAC to LTV ratio, but once people start to understand a little bit more as to where this money is coming from, what it's been assigned to do, potentially that also helps that kind of thoughtfulness and that kind of self-policing of these policies as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple of things that come to mind when you say that. Is one, having that, what would I do if it was my own money? And I'm not necessarily saying you're always going to change your mind, because some people are absolutely rubbish with their money and you wouldn't trust them with the company. But at least, I mean, certainly in my experience, where people will come to me for, and it's not necessarily on travel, it might be other things, but whatever, people come to me absolutely adamant that they want to spend this money. And I'll go and I'll maybe ask, okay, well, what would you do if it was your own money? And all of a sudden, you can see them starting to think differently, and they're not so adamant anymore. That's the first thing. And then the second thing, which just escaped my mind, I can't remember what the thinking about. I can't remember what the other thing was. Yeah, sorry.
I really like those answers. I was going to ask how can finance leaders better support people and empower them to make those decisions, but Paddy beat me to it. And as an accountant, that was my ideal answer. So well done for that. We've just had a question which I think really speaks to those answers. Somebody's just asked, what is a reasonable level for client entertaining? So if you were to help guide a person to determine that for themselves, how would you speak to that question?
For me, listen, mine goes to typically, it really depends on all sorts of your unit economics as your business. For instance, if it's your top client and it's a 7-figure client, that budget's going to be very different to, if this is one off, 5,000 clients that, might be, a 5-figure client. So I believe a lot of that might depend on your unit economics, the efficiency of the business, your margins, and everything that come with that. But I don't know if Vicky or Tony would have other opinions on that.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. It depends on the situation, and then I think it comes back to similar to what I was saying before about, if it was your own money, how much would you be spending? If it was a really, really important client, you'd be thinking, right, I'm prepared to put a bit of investment into this. Whereas if it was something that you thought wasn't going to be a fruitful relationship, and I think when you can just slightly twist your mindset around thinking about what would I do if it was my own money, you probably would make a better, a more informed decision.
That is some pretty really good answers. I would totally be 100% on board with those. I'd like to give us a few minutes for any questions. If not, I'm more than happy to continue this discussion. But if anybody has any questions, just pop them in the chat. Otherwise, I just probing more into this because it's such a fascinating subject. What about very young hires, so more junior people who maybe weren't hired pre-lockdown, whose normal has always been this kind of remote hybrid, no travel rules? Although you've already outlined sort of helping them level up their financial literacy, how else can business leaders support those promising talents to navigate a fairly uncertain ecosystem that they've not really too much experience with?
I think for me, it's about being open and honest and being vulnerable yourself as a leader. People might come in thinking, and if they're away traveling on their own or whatever it may be, they may think they've got to have all the answers, and they're scared of making mistakes. If there's maybe a bit of ambiguity around the travel policy, for example, they may be really scared of making mistakes. And if you can be open, and this applies to not just travel, just more generally, if you can be open to the fact that actually you've made mistakes, if you're a leader in the business, you've made mistakes, and cite examples of that, people will, and it helps create that culture. The mistakes are actually not too bad. It's all right as long as you're learning from them. And as long as, like with regard to travel, as long as there are broad parameters in place and there's that open invitation and that guidance that actually, if you are unsure, please reach out, please have a conversation with someone. But creating, back to what Paddy was talking about earlier on in the conversation about the culture, it's so important, particularly with young people, to create a culture whereby people feel open and that they're allowed to express concerns that they've got, express if they've made a mistake or if they don't know the right way to do a particular thing. And I think, as I said, I think that goes wider than just travel policy very much.
Thanks, Tony. We've got another. Is it typical to support employees with personal mobile phone costs during business trips if they don't have a work phone? Oh, that's an interesting one, because more and more of us don't have work phones. I certainly don't. What do you see in terms of what, I mean, Paddy, you've got great insight. What are you thinking is the leading voice there?
Yeah, I think it might also be interesting to get Travel Perk's opinion on this, because I'm sure you've probably seen a lot of travels. I can speak to what we do ourselves now. Typically, thankfully, in Europe, to be honest, with the roaming charges are kind of leveled out. It's not as bad, and we don't have too much US travel. Now, from a previous career, we did a lot of US travel, and I know the line was always to buy a SIM card when you get to the States, because otherwise you go on, you send 4 emails from your mobile phone, next thing you know it's £100, and genuinely it can get to that level. But that was always our policy. There was, by all means, expense a SIM card when you get to the States and use that. But I'm not too sure. I'd love to hear kind of the Travel Perk perspective.
Yeah, so from our side at Travel Perk, we kind of get involved with this because it affects our customers and also their travellers as well. But yeah, to Paddy's point, in Europe, it's equaled out. It really isn't so much of a cost, or a concern. But for customers that are traveling internationally to the US, to the Far East, then yeah, there are additional costs. And either having a SIM card or, pre-purchasing a package or a package on arrival, which gives you, the data that you're going to need to be able to work as you're used to doing. Most of us, whether it's booking travel on our phone or keeping up to date with emails and things, we want to be able to do that. But also, from making sure that from a duty of care perspective, people have got credit, can contact people, can get help if they need to. So yeah, it's quite normal to include that and to have that written into a policy too.
Great, and we've got one more question, if we can squeeze it in before we wrap up. Somebody just asked, with the variable cost of hotels, how do you encourage people to make the right decision there?
Yeah.
So talking across cities, so say like New York is going to be vastly different to.
Yeah, it's a great question. The costs are definitely changing. It's definitely feedback that we're getting from customers. We can see ourselves, and the industry is talking about as hotel nights and hotel rooms are suddenly getting more and more full because we all want to go away or travel on business, which is great for us. So yeah, I think it's there's a lot that we can do. At Travel Perk, we help our customers build a policy that maybe has got some rate caps in, but actually you can make it specific to a particular city too. So maybe you have an X amount rate cap across all of your hotel spend, but your key destinations, that you travel to New York or Tokyo or London, for example. And in those exceptions, you want that rate cap to be slightly different, and we can build in exceptions. So for the end user, the experience is the same. It still shows if it's in policy or out of policy. They don't need to know the mechanics behind it, but you do have that capability, absolutely.
So I did a panel with Spendesk again.
Yeah.
Favorite, obviously, and we had Sabrina from Pento, who gave an amazing answer to the same question. It seems to be a very hot question. And she mentioned getting the stakeholders responsible for those variable travels involved in it and passing them much more responsibility on saying this is what it needs to be, and this is how we're going to manage the return on investment on the spend. So a little bit of what you've touched on, Paddy, and a little bit of what you've touched on, Vicky. Anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I think from our side, now what we've done is very similar to what Vicky has mentioned. As I said, most of our travel is European, and we have looked and we've taken some average rates across our main destinations, being Hamburg, Berlin, Paris, and here in London, probably the main destinations that we have people kind of going to the different offices. So we've taken kind of general rates based on what those cities are. I believe it, slightly higher in London and Paris than maybe it is in Berlin, and so on and so forth. Again, these are driven by guidelines. I think the one thing I would think about on these points is a lot of what we find, what I find personally when booking hotel stays as well, is you can take the average rate, but if it's an average rate from a month's time versus, and again, going back to the first point, I think I said on this trigger happy travel, when you're just traveling, whatever, you will not stay within those rates. If I'm going to go and book a hotel for Paris tomorrow night, I will not be able to find one anywhere near the budget. So I think it goes back to when you're thinking about spend per night, or this travel spend, how much you want to do per night. It's how you need to be thoughtful about the travel that you are making, because otherwise you won't be able to stay in these things. If you're able to book a month in advance, you're going to get quite competitive rates. You're not going to see things being as booked out, and that's again, and if you can bake that into maybe some of the policies, that if you are traveling, you should have this booked 3 weeks in advance where possible. You build that culture. It's going to drive, not only it's going to drive your costs down, but it's going to drive towards more thoughtful thinking. You actually saying, well, I need to travel in 6 weeks' time. I'm going to book it now. I have 6 weeks to plan my time in Paris with the team, set up my meetings, making sure that we, do these activities that are going to bind us together and be valuable. So I think, something as, probably quite operational as how much you spend on a hotel per night, you can actually really utilize that to drive the right culture around why you're traveling in the first place.
That's a brilliant answer. Thank you very much. We've got an amazing question just come in about sustainable travel, but I think we could probably go for quite a while on that. So I will leave that. If the person who wrote that wants to drop us their email, perhaps we can answer that one by email after the conversation. But thank you everybody for joining us. A huge thank you to our speakers, Tony, Paddy, and Vicky. You've done an amazing job of enlightening us all. So thank you for your wonderful contributions, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks everybody. Thanks, Leona.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, folks. Hope you enjoyed.